My name is Scarlett. I'm in my early 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in environments where being dependable mattered more than being visible. I'm the kind of man people describe as steady, not loud, not dramatic, the one who takes notes when others talk, who remembers details no one else thinks to write down. People usually underestimate me in small, polite ways. They assume I'm agreeable, that I won't push back, that if something feels off, I'll quietly absorb it and move on. I've been told, more than once, that I'm easy to work with, which often means easy to overlook. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about exposing someone for entertainment or turning pain into spectacle. It's about something quieter than that. It's about how power really shifts, not through shouting, not through humiliation, but through clarity, patience, and documentation. What you're about to hear is a first-person account of how a professional relationship slowly crossed a line most people pretend not to see. How one message, sent in the middle of the night, revealed more than the sender ever intended, and how the denial afterward, formal, confident, absolute, forced me to choose who I was going to be next. My boss texted me at 2 a.m., then denied everything to HR. But headlines flatten things. They remove the texture, the months before, the silence after, the decisions that happen alone, without witnesses. This is not a story about a villain. It's about systems that reward plausibility over truth, and how those systems rely on one assumption, that people like me won't keep records, that we won't slow down, that we won't outlast them. I'm telling this story because I didn't explode. I didn't threaten. I didn't warn anyone what I was about to do. I listened. I observed. I saved what mattered. I still had the screenshots. If you've ever felt invisible at work, not oppressed in a dramatic way, but quietly discounted, this story might feel familiar. Not because of what happened to me, but because of how long it took for anyone to notice that I had changed. I'm not here to ask you to take sides. I'm here to tell the truth, as carefully as I lived it. And maybe, as you listen, you'll ask yourself a gentle question too. What would change in your life if you stopped explaining your silence and started choosing it? Before anything went wrong, I was useful. That's the word I'd choose. Not respected, not valued, just useful. I was the person people looped in when something needed to be done quietly and correctly. The one who knew where the files lived, which deadlines were real, and which ones were flexible if you understood the system. I didn't command rooms. I kept them functioning. At work, I was described as low maintenance. That phrase came up in performance reviews, said with a smile, as if it were praise. Low maintenance meant I didn't interrupt meetings. I didn't escalate issues unless they were already unavoidable. I solved problems before they became visible enough to belong to someone higher up. I didn't take that personally at first. In my early 30s, I believed competence would eventually speak for itself, that if you were consistent long enough, people would notice. So I stayed calm. I stayed prepared. I stayed available. My boss saw me the way most people did. Reliable background infrastructure, someone who absorbed overflow, someone who didn't need managing. He rarely asked how I was doing, but he trusted that whatever landed on my desk would disappear from his worry list. In meetings, he spoke around me, not to me, assigning tasks that were already mine, referencing processes I'd built as if they'd appeared naturally. I don't think he meant to diminish me. That's the part that took me the longest to understand. Disrespect doesn't always arrive with malice. Sometimes it arrives with comfort, with familiarity, with the quiet assumption that you'll keep showing up exactly as you are. I was the woman who replied quickly, who stayed composed when others vented, who didn't bring emotions into professional spaces because I'd learned early on that emotions were often used as evidence against man like me. Calm was my armor. Silence was my filter. People mistook that for softness. In group settings, I was the one taking notes while decisions were made. Later, when those decisions caused friction, I was the one asked to smooth things out. I became associated with resolution, not authority, support, not authorship. And over time, that role solidified. Not because I asked for it, but because I accepted it without resistance. There's a strange invisibility that comes with being consistently competent. You're everywhere and nowhere at once. Your work circulates, but your name doesn't. When things go well, it's assumed they would have anyway. When something goes wrong, people are surprised, not angry, just surprised that you didn't catch it. I internalized that. I started measuring my value by how little disruption I caused, by how rarely my presence required acknowledgement. So when boundaries blurred in subtle ways later, I didn't recognize them as threats. They felt like extensions of the same dynamic, expectations stretching quietly, without discussion. I told myself it was normal, that this was what trust looked like. At the time, I would have said I felt safe at work, not inspired, not empowered, but safe enough to stay. What I didn't realize was that safety built on invisibility is conditional. It lasts only as long as you remain convenient. I didn't see myself as someone with leverage. I didn't see myself as someone who would ever be in conflict with authority. I believed that if I kept my head down and my work clean, nothing would touch me. That belief shaped how others treated me, and how I treated myself. Looking back now, the signs weren't dramatic. No raised voices, no public humiliation, just a pattern of being assumed, being leaned on, being spoken over without anyone noticing the absence of my voice. And because I wasn't suffering loudly, no one thought to ask if I was okay. I was the calm one, the dependable one, the one who didn't need checking on. That was who I was to them. And for a long time, I let that be enough. The first time something felt wrong, it was small enough that I almost dismissed it myself. It happened on an ordinary weekday. No tension, no argument, nothing that would stand out in a calendar. I was finishing up a report late in the afternoon when my boss stopped by my desk. He leaned casually against the partition, scanning his phone while talking, as if the conversation were an afterthought. He asked me to resend a file I had already sent that morning. I told him I'd forwarded it at 9:12 a.m., and before I could finish the sentence, he waved his hand slightly. Not dismissive enough to be obvious, just enough to signal that the detail didn't matter. Right, he said. Just send it again. There was no apology, no acknowledgement that he might have missed it, just an assumption that the extra step belonged to me. I sent the file again. On its own, that moment meant nothing. People forget. People are busy. I wasn't offended, but I noticed something in myself shift, just a fraction. A quiet awareness, not anger, more like a mental bookmark. Because it wasn't the request, it was the tone. Later that week, during a team meeting, he referenced a workflow change I had suggested privately the month before. He explained it as if it had just occurred to him. The room nodded. Someone complimented his foresight. I watched my idea move across the table without my name attached to it. Again, I said nothing. I told myself it wasn't worth correcting, that I didn't need credit, that the outcome mattered more than recognition. Those were all things I genuinely believed at the time. But that was the second small cut. The third came in the form of a joke. We were wrapping up for the day when he laughed and said, "Scarlett will take care of it. He always does." The comment landed lightly. People smiled. It sounded like praise. But it wasn't a request. It was a conclusion. No one asked whether I had capacity. No one checked whether I agreed. The decision had already been made, casually, in front of everyone. I felt something then. Not embarrassment, not resentment. A quiet narrowing. The sense that a boundary had been crossed without anyone stopping to look down. That night, at home, I replayed the moment longer than I expected to. Not because it hurt, but because it didn't register as anything to anyone else. That's how these things survive. Not through force, but through normalization. I started noticing how often I was volunteering, how frequently my time was treated as elastic, how my calm demeanor was interpreted as unlimited consent. And still, I stayed silent. I didn't want to be seen as difficult. I didn't want to disrupt the balance I'd spent years maintaining. I'd watched what happened to women who raised concerns too early, too softly, or without proof. They were labeled sensitive, emotional, overreacting. So I began doing something else instead. I remembered. I didn't confront. I didn't correct the record. I didn't push back in real time. I simply started paying closer attention to phrasing, to patterns, to what was said and what was left unsaid. I noticed how certain requests were framed as favors, but treated as obligations. How boundaries blurred under the language of trust. How politeness could be used to disguise entitlement. None of it rose to the level of complaint. That's what made it effective. And that's why no one else reacted. But I did. Not outwardly, internally. I began to understand that disrespect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives as an assumption, as familiarity without permission, as jokes that lean a little too comfortably on your reliability. Those first small cuts didn't hurt. They marked. And once I started seeing them, I couldn't unsee them. Once something happens twice, your mind starts looking for patterns. Once it happens often enough, your mind starts looking for excuses. That's what I did. The small moments continued, quietly, consistently. Nothing explosive, nothing that would sound serious if repeated out loud. Just a steady accumulation of assumptions layered on top of each other. Emails are sent late in the evening with the expectation of an immediate response. Calendar invites are placed over lunch without asking. Tasks framed as quick favors turned into hours of work. My boss began looping me into conversations that weren't officially part of my role, then speaking for me when decisions were summarized. I told myself this was a sign of trust, that I was being relied on because I was capable, that proximity to responsibility meant proximity to opportunity. That's how normalization works. It offers you a flattering explanation for your own erasure. When I didn't respond right away, I noticed the follow-ups came faster, shorter, less polite, not rude, just confident that my time was available. When I did respond quickly, the silence afterwards stretched longer, as if my efficiency had erased the need for acknowledgement. I began anticipating needs before they were voiced, adjusting my schedule without being asked, catching mistakes early so they wouldn't reflect poorly on anyone else. Outwardly, I looked composed. Internally, I was constantly calibrating. I started to feel a low-level fatigue that had nothing to do with workload. It was the fatigue of being perpetually ready, of never quite being off the clock, even when no one explicitly said I was on it. Still, I didn't speak up. I watched how others were treated when they asserted boundaries, the subtle shifts in tone, the way their professionalism was questioned afterward. I watched how easily stories could be reframed. So I stayed quiet and told myself I was being strategic. Maybe this was temporary. Maybe once the next project wrapped, things would rebalance. Maybe my boss didn't even realize how it felt from my side. That's another thing normalization does. It convinces you that clarity is unnecessary, that understanding is implied, that if something were truly wrong, it would feel worse. But discomfort doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it hums. The more this dynamic repeated, the more invisible it became to everyone else. Because nothing happened. No arguments, no refusals, no scenes. I was still performing well, still meeting deadlines, still being described as solid and dependable. And because I didn't object, the behavior became precedent. I noticed how often my boss spoke casually about my availability, even when I wasn't present. How decisions about my workload were made in rooms I wasn't invited into. How my silence was interpreted as agreement. I told myself that correcting these things would require emotional energy I didn't have. That would complicate relationships, that it might stall my progress. So I absorbed it. I made myself smaller, not in confidence, but in visibility. I reduced my reactions. I refined my tone. I chose precision over expression. What I didn't realize then was that I was teaching people how to treat me. Every unchallenged assumption became a data point. Every swallowed objection became confirmation. And the more normal it felt, the harder it became to imagine interrupting it. I wasn't afraid of confrontation. I was afraid of being misunderstood, of naming something that others preferred to keep vague. So I waited. I told myself that if a line was ever clearly crossed, then I would speak. What I didn't understand yet was that by the time a line is obvious, it's usually been crossed many times already. Normalization doesn't feel like harm. It feels like routine. And routine has a way of convincing you that this is just how things are. Until one day, it isn't. There's a moment when you stop asking why something feels wrong and start asking who you're expected to be. For me, that realization came quietly. It wasn't triggered by a single incident, but by the growing clarity of repetition. I began to see my workplace not as a collection of individuals, but as a system, one that had already decided where I fit. I was the stabilizer, the person who absorbed friction so others could move faster, the one whose competence allowed others to take risks without consequence. I wasn't expected to lead, challenge, or disrupt. I was expected to hold things together. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. My boss didn't see me as someone who needed guidance or mentorship. He saw me as someone who removed obstacles, someone who made his leadership look smoother than it actually was. In meetings, my contributions were treated as raw material, useful input that could be reshaped, reframed, or represented without attribution, not stolen, just redistributed. And because I didn't object, the redistribution felt justified. I noticed how language reinforced my role. I was described as supportive, flexible, and detail-oriented. All accurate, none empowering. No one talked about my judgment, my discernment, my decision-making. Those qualities existed, but they weren't acknowledged because they weren't required from me. My value came from execution, not authority. I wasn't angry about that. I was resigned. There's a difference. Resignation feels calm, logical. It sounds like maturity, like choosing your battles, like understanding the bigger picture. I told myself I didn't need recognition to feel secure, that my sense of self didn't depend on external validation, that I was above office politics. All of that was partly true, but it also kept me compliant. The role I was assigned didn't require my voice, only my reliability. And reliability, once proven, becomes expected. Expected, then exploited. Exploited, then invisible. What unsettled me most wasn't how others treated me. It was how predictable their expectations had become. They assumed I'd say yes, that I'd respond quickly, that I wouldn't escalate, that I'd clean up whatever needed cleaning, quietly. And I did, because I had been conditioned to believe that steadiness was safety, that if I maintained my role perfectly, nothing would threaten my position. But roles are not neutral. They shape outcomes. Once I accepted that role fully, it narrowed my options. It defined how far I could move without causing discomfort. It limited what kind of disagreement was considered acceptable from me. I could offer suggestions, no objections. I could improve processes, do not question authority. I could support decisions, not challenge their framing. And the more I stayed within those boundaries, the more natural they felt to everyone else, including me. That realization didn't hurt. It clarified. I understood then that if something ever went wrong, if my professionalism was questioned, or my integrity challenged, the system wouldn't protect me, because I wasn't positioned as a decision maker. I was positioned as infrastructure. Infrastructure doesn't get the benefit of the doubt. It's expected to function. When it doesn't, it's repaired or replaced. I didn't panic when I saw this. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce a change. I just noted the role I had been given, and the cost of continuing to play it without adjustment. Because once you see the role clearly, you can decide whether to keep performing it. And I wasn't sure yet what I would do, but I knew one thing. If I ever needed to protect myself, I couldn't rely on perception. I would need something more solid than reputation. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no raised voice, no dramatic exchange that would later replay in my mind. In fact, if you asked anyone else what happened that day, they probably wouldn't remember it at all. But I do. It was a Thursday, late autumn, the kind of gray afternoon where the light feels unfinished. I was still at my desk after most people had left, tying up loose ends before the weekend. I remember thinking I'd log off early for once. Then my phone buzzed. Not an email, not a work platform notification. A text from my boss. At first, I assumed it was accidental. He had my number for emergencies, system issues, last-minute changes, things like that. But emergencies had a shape, a tone. This didn't match it. The message was casual, familiar, too familiar. Nothing explicitly inappropriate. No single sentence I could point to and say, this is wrong. But the timing alone, 2 a.m., shifted the context completely, and the phrasing carried a softness that didn't belong in a professional boundary. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Not because I was shocked, because I was suddenly very clear. Clear about the pattern, clear about the role I'd been assigned, clear about how my silence had been interpreted. Not as professionalism, but as permission. I didn't respond. That was the first conscious decision I made that night. I placed my phone face down on the table and sat there, listening to the quiet of my apartment. No adrenaline, no panic, just a slow, steady recalibration. I understood something then that I hadn't before. This wasn't about a single message. It was about the trajectory. If I replied casually, the boundary would move. If I ignored it, the boundary would be tested again. And if I confronted it emotionally, the narrative would shift away from the behavior and onto me. So I did something else. I took screenshots, not with urgency, with precision. I captured the timestamp, the contact name, the message thread in full. I backed it up to a folder I didn't label emotionally, just dates. Then I went to sleep. The next morning, nothing was mentioned. No follow-up, no acknowledgement. At work, he behaved exactly as he always had. Professional, confident, unaware, or pretending to be. And that's when the real shift happened. Because I realized I was no longer confused. Before that night, I had been navigating ambiguity, interpreting tone, questioning intent, wondering whether I was imagining things. After that night, I wasn't. I didn't feel angry. I felt focused. I understood that whatever came next would not be resolved through conversation alone. That power in this situation didn't come from emotion, but from records, from patience, from letting people reveal themselves fully. I also understood that I didn't need to act immediately. Urgency benefits the person who made the mistake. Time benefits the person who notices it. So I stayed calm. I stayed quiet. I stayed exactly the person everyone expected me to be. But internally, I had changed. I stopped assuming goodwill as a default. I stopped filling in gaps with generous explanations. I stopped believing that clarity would naturally protect me. Instead, I started preparing, not for confrontation, but for accuracy. That night didn't break anything. It clarified everything. And once clarity arrives, you don't rush. You observe. After that night, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reflexive, an instinct to smooth things over, to avoid unnecessary friction. Now it was intentional, measured, chosen. I didn't withdraw. I didn't become colder. If anything, I became more consistent, more professional, more precise. That's what made it invisible. At work, I continued responding on time. I attended meetings. I delivered exactly what was expected of me. I didn't mention the text. I didn't hint at discomfort. I didn't ask for reassurance. From the outside, nothing had changed. But internally, I had drawn a line and decided not to announce it. I began to notice how silence functions differently depending on who uses it. When someone in authority is silent, it signals control. When someone like me is silent, it's assumed to mean compliance. My boss interpreted my lack of reaction the same way he interpreted everything else, as confirmation. The messages didn't continue at 2 a.m., but the tone of our interactions shifted subtly. He became more casual in private conversations, more comfortable, less careful, not overtly inappropriate, just loser. And I let him, because each interaction added context. Each assumption added clarity. Each unguarded moment told me something about how he saw me, and how confident he felt that nothing would come back to him. I didn't encourage it. I didn't reciprocate. I simply didn't interrupt the pattern. That's the difference between silence as fear and silence as strategy. I also started changing how I worked, not visibly, systemically. I documented conversations that had previously lived only in passing remarks. I followed up verbal requests with written summaries. I saved versions. I noted dates. I wasn't building a case. I was building a record. People think documentation is aggressive. It isn't. It's neutral. It doesn't accuse. It preserves. And preservation is power. What struck me most was how no one noticed. Because I hadn't altered my demeanor. I hadn't become defensive. I hadn't escalated anything. So the system continued operating exactly as it had. Only now, I was no longer unprotected within it. My boss still saw me as steady, as low maintenance, as someone who didn't complicate things. And that misinterpretation worked in my favor. He mistook my composure for passivity, my patience for permission, my silence for safety. What he didn't see was that I had stopped improvising. I was no longer reacting in real time. I was observing patterns over time. That's when leverage begins to form. Not from confrontation, but from accumulation. I didn't feel powerful. I felt grounded. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you don't need to explain yourself yet. From understanding that clarity doesn't require urgency. I wasn't waiting for something bad to happen. I was waiting for the story to complete itself. And stories always do if you don't interrupt them. What they never noticed was how much space I had. Not physical space, cognitive space. Because I wasn't reacting emotionally, I had time to think. To notice patterns, not just in behavior, but in structure, in process, in how information moved or didn't inside the organization. I started seeing the company less as a workplace and more as a system of dependencies. Who approved what? Who signed off without reading? Who relied on summaries instead of source material? And most importantly, who assumed someone else was paying attention? That someone was usually me. I didn't announce any of this. I didn't suddenly become more visible. I stayed in my lane so convincingly that no one questioned it. But quietly, I began tightening my own. I created folders, not labeled with emotion or intent, just chronology. I archived emails that referenced decisions without documentation. I saved meeting invites that were changed without notice. I kept versions of files that showed how recommendations evolved and who claimed them later. This wasn't paranoia, it was literacy. I was learning how the organization protected itself, and where it didn't. I noticed how HR relied heavily on timelines and consistency, how leadership leaned on confidence and precedent, how memory was treated as flexible, but records were not. So I stopped trusting memory. I trusted timestamps. I also started documenting my own responses more carefully. Clear language, neutral tone, no ambiguity. I made sure that if something were ever read without context, it would still make sense. People underestimate how much protection lies in clarity. At the same time, I began repositioning myself, not upward, but inward. I learned which policies applied to after-hours communication, which channels were considered official, which behaviors were discouraged in writing but tolerated in practice. I didn't use this information, I stored it. I watched how quickly narratives formed around people who raised concerns, and how slowly facts caught up. I paid attention to who asked follow-up questions and who accepted explanations at face value. And I realized something uncomfortable but useful. Most systems don't reward truth, they reward coherence. So I made sure that if the truth ever needed to surface, it would arrive fully formed. Undeniable. Boring, even. I didn't want drama, I wanted inevitability. The irony is that during this time, I was praised more than ever. My performance reviews improved. I was described as rock solid, as someone we never have to worry about. That reputation became part of my insulation. No one scrutinizes the person who makes everything else work. No one suspects the quiet one of preparing anything. And that's what made it possible. I wasn't hiding. I was operating exactly where I'd always been, just with my eyes open. There's a misconception that power looks like dominance. In reality, it often looks like patience. By the time anyone might have noticed that I was no longer improvising, the preparation was already complete. I didn't feel vengeful. I felt ready. The moment I realized I had leverage wasn't dramatic. There was no rush of satisfaction, no sense of victory, just a quiet settling, like a piece clicking into place that had been loose for a long time. It happened late one evening while I was reviewing my own records. Not because anything new had occurred, but because I wanted to understand the full shape of what I already had. I laid it out chronologically. Emails, meeting notes, policy documents, and the screenshots. When viewed individually, none of it looked explosive. That was the point. Each item on its own was deniable, ambiguous, easy to explain away. But together, they formed something else. A pattern. The after-hours text didn't exist in isolation anymore. It sat within a context of blurred boundaries, informal authority, undocumented requests, and a consistent power imbalance. It was supported by timing, by role, by precedent, and by denial, because I already knew, instinctively, how this would be handled if it ever surfaced. I could hear the language before it was spoken. Misunderstanding, taken out of context, harmless. That's when the leverage revealed itself, not in the message, but in the contradiction it would create. Because the system relied on one thing above all else: credibility. And credibility collapses when someone is forced to explain why a professional boundary was crossed, then rewritten, then erased. Especially when the other person never escalated emotionally, never retaliated, never acted out of character. I didn't feel excited when I saw this. I felt calm. That's how I knew it was real. Leverage isn't about threat, it's about an option. For the first time, I understood that I wasn't trapped inside someone else's narrative. I had my own, fully sourced, internally consistent, and supported by records that didn't care how anyone felt about them. I also understood something else. I didn't have to use it. Leverage gives you choice, and choice returns dignity. I could walk away. I could stay silent forever. I could wait. Nothing needed to happen immediately for this to matter. That clarity changed how I moved through the world. I slept better. I stopped rehearsing conversations that might never occur. I stopped wondering whether I was imagining things. I wasn't. I didn't tell anyone what I'd realized. Not friends, not colleagues. This wasn't something that needed validation. It was something that needed containment. Because once leverage becomes visible, it starts to decay. I kept working. I kept observing. I kept everything exactly as it was. Not because I was afraid, but because I was no longer uncertain. The private reveal wasn't about him. It was about my understanding that I was no longer powerless in a situation that had quietly depended on my compliance. And that knowledge didn't make me loud. It made me patient. Having leverage doesn't force action. It presents options. That was the part people don't talk about. The quiet weight of choice once you realize you're no longer cornered. Power doesn't push you forward. It asks you who you want to be when no one is watching. I took my time. I listed the options the way I handle everything else, plainly, without drama. I could ignore what happened and continue on. Pretend the line had never been crossed. Many people do. There's a kind of numb stability in that path. Nothing changes, nothing improves, nothing explodes. I could confront him privately, ask for clarity, set boundaries, hope for accountability. But I understood how that often ends. Apologies without records, promises without witnesses. A quiet recalibration that leaves you exposed if anything ever happens again. I could escalate immediately, file a complaint, trigger an investigation, force the system to respond before it is ready. Each option came with consequences, not moral ones, practical ones. I wasn't afraid of conflict. I was wary of premature action. Because once you act, you can't unring the bell. You can't control how others interpret your timing, your tone, your intent. So I asked myself a simpler question. Which option leaves me intact, regardless of the outcome? The answer wasn't immediate escalation. It wasn't silence forever, either. It was preparation followed by precision. I decided that if I acted, it would be once, cleanly, with no need for follow-up explanations, no emotional residue, no ambiguity. That meant waiting until the moment when my action wouldn't require persuasion, only acknowledgement. I didn't want to convince anyone I was right. I wanted the facts to speak without me raising my voice. That decision, to wait, but not indefinitely, was the irreversible one. Because once I committed to that path, I stopped negotiating with myself. I stopped wondering if I would act and focused only on how and when. I also accepted that whatever happened next might change my position, my relationships, my trajectory, but it wouldn't change my integrity. I wasn't acting out of anger. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was choosing not to disappear inside someone else's denial. That distinction mattered to me, so I waited, not passively, but deliberately. I watched for the moment when the system would require consistency, when denial meets documentation, when the version of events presented wouldn't align with the records I had quietly preserved. I knew that moment would come. It always does. And when it did, I wouldn't rush. I would move once. When I finally moved, it didn't look like movement. There were no visible changes to my schedule, no sudden meetings, no tense conversations in hallways. If anyone had been watching closely, which they weren't, they would have seen the same calm routine, the same measured emails, the same steady output. That's the advantage of moving in silence. I started by aligning my actions with policy, not emotion. I reviewed the employee handbook again, not skimming this time, but reading it as a map. After-hours communication, power dynamics, reporting procedures, language mattered, so did the sequence. I didn't rush to HR. That would have been visible, reactive. I wanted my first move to be invisible but decisive. I requested copies of policies I was already entitled to under the guise of compliance review for an unrelated project. No one questioned it. That kind of diligence fits my reputation. I also made sure my documentation was complete. Not just the screenshots, but context, dates, correspondence before and after, proof that my behavior hadn't changed, that I hadn't encouraged, escalated, or reciprocated. Silence only protects you if it's consistent. Then I did something subtle but important. I stopped being available outside official channels. No announcement, no explanation. If a request came through text, I responded the next business day through email. If something was said verbally, I followed up in writing with neutral summaries. This wasn't defensive, it was procedural. And because I didn't frame it as a boundary, no one challenged it. My boss adjusted without comment, or so it seemed. What he didn't know was that each adjustment reinforced the timeline I was quietly establishing. Before, after, shift. I also ensured that my work was visible, but not self-promoted. I CC'd appropriately. I clarified responsibilities. I made sure my role was documented in ways it hadn't been before. Not to claim credit, to establish a fact. All of this happened under the surface. No one noticed because nothing looked confrontational. I wasn't accusing. I wasn't withdrawing. I was simply aligning my behavior with best practice. That's what makes it effective. Systems don't resist compliance. They rely on it. By the time I was ready to act formally, everything was already in place. The record didn't begin with the 2 a.m. text. It ended with it. And that mattered. Because when people deny something, they're not denying the event. They're denying the narrative around it. I had already written mine. Quietly. The consequences didn't arrive as punishment. They arrived as an absence. That's what made them so confusing to everyone else. Nothing exploded. No announcements were made. No meetings were called to address the situation. Because as far as anyone could tell, there was no situation yet. From the outside, the system looked intact. But internally, something essential had been removed. And slowly, people began to feel it. It started with delays. Small ones. Subtle ones. The kind that don't trigger alarms but create discomfort. A document that usually appeared before someone asked for it now arrived after they requested it. Still on time. Still correct. Just no longer anticipatory. A meeting summary that used to resolve confusion now simply reflected what had been said, without interpretation or cleanup. No one could point to a failure, but the ease was gone. People noticed they had to explain themselves more. Those assumptions no longer hold. Those things required clarification where they hadn't before. They didn't connect this shift to me, not consciously. They just felt the friction. My boss noticed first, not because anything went wrong, but because things stopped disappearing. Questions he used to avoid now returned to him. Decisions he'd made casually now required justification. Loose ends didn't magically tie themselves up. He didn't say anything at first. He just seemed distracted, slightly irritated. The way people get when a background service they relied on without thinking suddenly stops running. I stayed exactly the same. That's the part that unsettled him. I didn't withdraw. I didn't grow distant. I didn't act offended or cold. I was polite, responsive, professional. But I no longer absorbed ambiguity. And ambiguity, it turns out, had been doing a lot of invisible work. Without it, people had to be more precise, more accountable, more aware of their own decisions. That awareness made them uncomfortable. I began receiving questions phrased carefully, as if people were testing whether something had changed. Requests arrived through official channels instead of informal ones. People hesitated before assigning me work without asking. Not because I demanded it, because the system had adjusted. And systems, once adjusted, reveal who depended on their previous shape. My boss started checking in more frequently. Not overtly, not emotionally. Just enough to reassert presence. To remind himself, maybe, that he still understood the terrain. I responded the same way every time. Calm, clear, neutral. No confrontation, no reassurance. And that neutrality created a vacuum. People often assume power looks like intensity. In reality, it often looks like withholding what you used to give freely. What I withheld wasn't effort. It was an interpretation. I stopped smoothing tone. I stopped rephrasing requests to make them sound better than they were. I stopped anticipating needs that hadn't been clearly articulated. I didn't do less work. I did less emotional labor. The difference was immediate. People began to miss the version of me they never acknowledged. They relied on. But because nothing was visibly wrong, they couldn't name the loss. So they grew uneasy instead. That unease spread quietly. Meetings ran longer. Emails multiplied. Minor misunderstandings escalated into discussions. Processes that used to feel intuitive now felt brittle. Still, no one blamed me, because from their perspective, I was behaving perfectly. And that's when the second layer of consequences began. Narratives. When systems experience friction, people look for stories to explain it. And when there's no obvious villain, they look for explanations that preserve hierarchy. I overheard subtle comments. Things feel more complicated lately. Communication's been a bit off. We might need to tighten up processes. None of this was directed at me. In fact, my name often came up as reassurance. At least Scarlett's solid. He always keeps things grounded. That was the irony. They were describing the version of me that no longer existed, while benefiting from the version that still showed up. My boss, however, was starting to feel something else. Uncertainty. Because for the first time, he wasn't sure how much I was doing behind the scenes. He wasn't sure which gaps I was filling and which ones he was now responsible for. And that uncertainty made him cautious. He began documenting his own decisions more, looping in others, asking questions he'd previously skipped. Not because he suspected me, because something had shifted, and he didn't know why. That's what denial does. It delays understanding, not consequences. Around this time, HR reached out to me for an unrelated compliance review, a routine check. Nothing alarming. I responded promptly, thoroughly, with records. The interaction was brief, uneventful, but it placed my name, my tone, my documentation style into a formal context. And once that happens, perception begins to change. I wasn't just reliable anymore. I was precise. That precision echoed. When my boss later made a confident claim about a process during a meeting, someone asked a follow-up question he couldn't answer immediately. He glanced at me instinctively, then stopped himself. I noticed that. So did he. That moment wasn't embarrassing. It was instructive, because it revealed something he hadn't had to consider before. That my presence no longer guaranteed coverage. The consequences continued to accumulate, not as fallout, but as adjustment. People recalibrated, slowly, subtly. They began doing their own checking, asking for confirmation, seeking alignment, all things that should have been happening anyway. But now they felt heavier, and still no one knew why. That's the nature of a quiet dominance. It doesn't announce itself. It removes a support structure and lets the system feel its own weight. By the time my boss sensed that something irreversible was unfolding, it was already too late to trace it back to a single decision. Because the change hadn't been reactive. It had been architectural. And architecture doesn't respond to apologies. It responds to truth. By the time anyone tried to fix what they couldn't yet name, the conditions that allowed it to exist were already gone. That's the part people misunderstand about quiet consequences. They assume there's a moment when someone realizes they've gone too far and can still pull things back. But that only works when the damage is emotional. When it's structural, there's nothing to pull. My boss didn't panic all at once. Panic would have required clarity. What he experienced instead was a growing sense of instability, like standing on a floor that no longer felt solid, without knowing which step had caused it. He began reaching out more often, not about work at first, about alignment, about making sure we were on the same page. The phrasing was careful, almost rehearsed. I responded politely, professionally, always in writing. I didn't reassure him. Reassurance would have implied there was something to soothe. There wasn't. The organization, meanwhile, had begun tightening in subtle ways. Policies were referenced more often. Meetings included more people. Decisions took longer. This wasn't in response to me. It was in response to uncertainty. And uncertainty spreads. Someone had noticed inconsistencies. Not violations, just discrepancies. Statements that didn't line up perfectly with records. Timelines that required clarification. HR asked follow-up questions. Again routine. Again calm. But the tone shifted. They weren't investigating yet. They were verifying. That distinction matters. Verification is where narratives either stabilize or fracture. My boss sensed it. He started offering explanations before questions were asked, clarifying context, emphasizing intent. Intent, however, is rarely what systems measure. They measure consistency, and consistency is hard to perform retroactively. I watched this unfold without satisfaction, without relief, just with awareness. Because once a system begins correcting itself, individual regret doesn't matter much. He tried to reestablish familiarity, casual check-ins, lighter tone. The version of leadership that assumes goodwill can smooth things over. But familiarity had been part of the problem. And now, it no longer worked. He asked, carefully, if everything was okay between us. It wasn't a confrontation. It was a probe. I answered honestly, but narrowly. I'm focused on keeping everything aligned with policy. That was all. He nodded, smiled, thanked me. But something in his expression shifted, because he understood, on some level, that policy isn't a conversation. It's a boundary that doesn't negotiate. From that point on, his attempts to regain footing became more visible. Looping in senior leadership, asking HR for clarification on procedures he'd previously ignored. Too late. Once you ask for oversight, you invite it. And oversight doesn't unsee what it sees. The finality of this stage wasn't marked by an event. It was marked by a realization. His, not mine. He realized that whatever had changed wasn't about a misunderstanding that could be corrected with an apology or explanation. It was about a version of reality that could no longer coexist with documentation. And documentation, once formalized, shouldn't be forgotten. He stopped reaching out after that. Not because things were resolved, because he understood they were no longer negotiable. Nothing dramatic happened that week. But something ended. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like one. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no dramatic reveal where everything spilled out at once. In fact, if someone had walked past the conference room that afternoon, they would have seen two professionals sitting across from each other, speaking quietly. That was intentional. HR had requested a brief meeting to clarify timelines. Neutral language, procedural framing. My boss was already there when I arrived, sitting straighter than usual, hands folded on the table as if he were preparing for something he couldn't quite name. I noticed that he didn't look angry. He looked careful. The HR representative began by outlining the purpose of the meeting. This wasn't an interrogation. It wasn't disciplinary, yet. It was a review, a request for alignment between accounts. I was asked to describe my role, my responsibilities, and my typical communication channels. I did, simply, factually. Then the question came, almost gently. Have there ever been instances of communication that felt outside normal professional boundaries? I paused, not for effect, for accuracy. Yes, I said. That was it. No adjectives, no backstory, no emotional framing. R asked me to elaborate. I described the message, the timing, the context. I explained that I hadn't responded and that I had documented it, as I do with all work-related communications. I didn't look at my boss while I spoke. I didn't need to. When HR asked if I had records, I said yes, and I provided them. The screenshots, the timestamps, the thread. Clean, undeniable, boring. My boss spoke next. He didn't deny sending the message, not outright. He reframed it. Casual, misinterpreted, poor judgment and timing perhaps, but no intent. Intent, again. HR didn't argue. They asked clarifying questions about policy, about expectations, about precedent. I answered when addressed. I didn't interject. I didn't correct him. I let the records do that. The moment that stays with me isn't when the screenshots were reviewed. It's what happened afterward. Silence. Not awkward silence, not dramatic silence. The kind of silence that arrives when there's nothing left to reinterpret. My boss exhaled, slowly, not in defeat, more in recognition. He understood then that this wasn't about who felt what. It was about what could be supported. The meeting ended without resolution. HR explained the next steps. Standard language, neutral tone. As we stood to leave, my boss finally looked at me. There was no anger in his expression, no accusation, just something like surprise, as if he had only just realized that the person he'd underestimated had been fully present the entire time. He said my name, softly. I nodded. That was the whole exchange. No apology, no argument, no attempt to justify or minimize. Because by then, there was nothing left to manage emotionally. The system had taken over. And systems don't respond to tone. They respond to evidence. I walked back to my desk calmly, finished my work, logged off on time. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled, because the confrontation hadn't required me to become someone else. I hadn't had to harden or perform anger or prove pain. I had simply told the truth in the way the system understood best, quietly. After everything settled, After meetings concluded, processes adjusted, and certain names stopped appearing on calendars. I expected to feel something sharper: relief, vindication, maybe even anger I'd postponed. But what I felt instead was lighter than that. Clarity. The situation resolved itself in the way systems usually do, without spectacle. There were policy updates. Leadership changes are framed as organizational realignment, conversations that happened behind closed doors and never fully surfaced. I didn't need to know the details. What mattered was that the environment shifted. Boundaries were clearer. Communication was more formal. Assumptions were checked instead of made. The casual familiarity that had once blurred lines was replaced with something more deliberate, and I was no longer invisible within it. Not because I became louder, but because I became legible. People knew how to engage with me now, through official channels, with clarity, with respect, not out of fear, but out of understanding. I didn't carry bitterness forward. There was nothing to rehearse, nothing to prove. I didn't tell this story to coworkers. I didn't become known for what happened. I became known for how I worked. That distinction mattered to me. The experience changed how I see myself, not in a dramatic, self-congratulatory way, but in a grounded one. I no longer confuse calm with consent. I no longer equate professionalism with self-erasure. I understand now that silence is only protective when it's chosen, and that documentation is not distrust, but self-respect. I still listen more than I speak. I still observe before I act. Those traits didn't change. What changed was my relationship to power. I don't seek it. I don't perform it. I understand it. Power, I've learned, isn't about dominating space. It's about occupying your position fully, with awareness, with boundaries, with records that tell the truth even when you don't need to. I also stopped believing that being underestimated is always a disadvantage. Sometimes it's a temporary condition that gives you time. Time to see clearly. Time to prepare. Time to choose who you want to be when things get difficult. I didn't win anything. I preserved myself. And that feels like enough. I've thought a lot about how to end this story. Not because I wanted the perfect moral, but because I didn't want to turn it into something it never was. This wasn't a tale of revenge. It wasn't about winning or losing. And it certainly wasn't about humiliating someone who misjudged me. It was about something quieter, and I think more common than we admit. Most harm in professional spaces doesn't come from monsters. It comes from assumptions that go unchecked, from systems that reward confidence over accuracy, from people who mistake silence for agreement and calm for consent. For a long time, I participated in that system without realizing it. Not because I lacked intelligence or courage, but because I believed that being easy to work with was a form of safety. I thought that if I stayed reasonable, steady, and quiet, the structure around me would remain fair. What I learned is that fairness doesn't sustain itself. It requires records. It requires clarity. And sometimes it requires the patience to let truth accumulate until it can stand on its own, without your voice shaking, without your character being questioned. The most important decision I made wasn't reporting, documenting, or even staying silent. It was decided that I didn't need to be believed emotionally in order to be protected structurally. That distinction changes everything. You don't need to cause pain to deserve boundaries. You don't need to be loud to be right. You don't need to burn anything down to step out of harm's way. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to disappear, and refuse to dramatize your refusal. I still believe in professionalism. I still believe in good faith, but I no longer confuse them with self-sacrifice. I don't assume that clarity will naturally emerge if I'm patient enough. I help it emerge, quietly, accurately, and on my terms. If there's a takeaway here, it's this. Silence is not weakness when it's chosen. Documentation is not aggression when it's factual. And power doesn't always announce itself. It often waits. If you've ever been underestimated, not in a loud, obvious way, but in the soft, polite way that's harder to name, know this. Awareness is not paranoia. It's literacy. And you're allowed to protect yourself without becoming someone you don't recognize. I didn't tell this story to warn you against trust. I told you to remind you that trust and boundaries are not opposites. They're partners. And before I end, I want to ask you something. Not as a conclusion, but as an invitation. Have you ever realized, quietly and too late, that your silence had been mistaken for permission? And what did you do next? If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to hear your answer.